to just really start with one question. I know we talked a bit about it before, and in some ways it moves on from your last, just the last few points you've been making. Speculative, yes, but I think certainly quite important. And that is it possible to be interested in philosophy or to be a philosopher, but also to be a very mainstream, safe, Sharif, nice, believing Muslim, like most of my colleagues here in this audience, or in fact, or a believer of any faith? Or do you have to get quite awkward and a bit heterodox to be a philosopher?
Well, I think Ibn Rushd himself was a very standard Maliki thinker. I mean, I don't think, as far as we know, there was nothing at all unusual about him from a religious point of view. Well, we just don't know. But I don't see why not. I mean, of course, some people are very good at putting their ideas in different sections, aren't they? So people have very radical ideas in one area of their life, and in another area of their life, they're very traditional. And you sometimes wonder how these things go together, but they do go together. I mean, for example, the surrealist painter, Magritte, who did all these really weird, amazing paintings, apparently, you know, when he went to the studio in the morning, he always put on a suit, a tie, very nicely polished shoes, bowler hat. You know, he looked the ultimate bourgeois in Belgium. That's an amazingly unusual and weird thinker. I mean, about a whole range of things. So, you know, I think it's quite possible to not use philosophy to raise issues about the rest of your life. Quite easy.
Thank you. The reason I'm raising my voice is because we haven't got the mics for this bit. So if you do ask a question, please speak up a little and tell us your name, tell us where you're from. And I'm going to start with the gentleman in the front row. He's one of our fellows.
Mohammed Amin. Mike, I've got a question and a suggestion. The question is, European Christian philosophers tried for centuries, I believe, to prove intellectually the existence of God, and eventually they gave up. Have there been similar serious efforts by Muslim philosophers, and if so, where did they get to? And my suggestion, in response to your question about the absence of philosophy amongst most of the Muslim world, is that I believe it derives from fear of the consequences of thinking.
Oh, I think that's a rather harsh thing to say. Yeah, I mean, a lot of Islamic philosophers. In fact, there is a book called The Encyclopedia of Theism, and I have a chapter in it on Islam, which looks at all or some of the major arguments. I mean, for Ibn Rushd, for example, the best argument for the existence of God was providence. He says, providence, we look at the world as a scientist, he says, and we cannot help conclude that there is a God who puts this all together. So, I mean, there are many different arguments. I mean, I don't think the arguments by Christians are any better than the argument. I don't think Christians have given up. They're still doing it, you know. I mean, every day another book comes out. But there is in the Christian world, I mean, this has been noticed, especially in the United States. There's a Society of Christian Philosophers in the United States, which is enormous and fantastically active. And people often argue from the other religions, why aren't we doing anything like that? Because the other religions, I mean, every year there's a conference somewhere in America by the Society of Applied Ethics in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam. And the Christian meeting is vast. The Jewish meeting is, well, you know, little, small. And the Islamic meeting is absolutely minuscule. I mean, why aren't Muslim doctors as fascinated by the ethical issues that arise, and there are lots of Muslim doctors in the United States and in Europe, why aren't they as fascinated by the ethical issues which arise in medicine as Christians and Jews are? Well, they don't seem to be. So I just don't know what the answer is.
Thank you. Gentleman there in the...
Frank Kelly. When I was studying philosophy at Burma College, which is not far from here, many years ago, one of my lecturers, who was an atheist, on observing that two former students had become priests, said, I don't know what's wrong with this place. It makes people religious. And of course, the approach of Burma was still very much analytic philosophy and so on. Do you think, I'm just having a shot at it, but maybe the Arab world, or Islamic world, doesn't need philosophy because it already has the answer?
Well, yeah.
But what is the question?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, how shall I put it? I mean, like, I think all knowledge is a good thing, I suppose. But I would be bound to say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm in the education business. I mean, it's a good thing to know about. Why, for example, I mean, here's an interesting phenomenon from the past. Christians and Jews were very interested in Islamic philosophy and Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and, a lot of it, very interested in it, and people, actually learned Arabic. People actually learned Arabic to come to Al-Andalus to study medicine. Yet there was very little of that on the other side. So, for example, it never occurred to Ibn Rushd, fascinated though he was with Aristotle, to ever learn Greek. He never said, now, if you and I were interested in a particular thinker who happened to write in a language we didn't know, we would learn their language if we were absolutely fascinated with them. But that never happened in the earlier Islamic world. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. I can't understand why. Because it's just such an obvious... I mean, it's said of Ibn Rushd that he worked every night of his life, except the night he got married and the night his father died, largely on Aristotle. Why didn't he want to read him in Greek? I mean, he didn't seem to want to. He didn't seem to think it was important. And that, I think, is an interesting cultural phenomenon, which perhaps suggests that there are quite basic differences between certain sorts of civilizations, which we don't really quite understand so far.
Thank you very much. So we're going to leave more hands. Professor Dean.
Indeed. First, thank you very much for a very, very lucid lecture. I want to take the question slightly in a different direction, if you don't mind. Given this audience, I think most of them would like to think that they are reformist Muslim or going in that direction. Therefore, in this moment, my question is, what is the single central idea of Ibn Rushd which reformist group should focus on and strive towards? Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it really isn't for me to tell people what they ought to be doing and thinking about. But I mean, the most important thing I think he had to suggest was the importance in everything, religion, law, medicine. The important thing was to work out how you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing in the way you're doing it, how you justify what you do. Don't just do things because they're traditional. I mean, like Al-Ghazali, he was a great opponent of taqlid. Don't do things just because they're traditional. And people would say that being progressive is just as traditional as being traditional. I mean, being progressive has its own accepted principles and ways of doing things, which a lot of progressive, in inverted commas, people just do without thinking about it. And this is a point which Hegel made in the 19th century, and of course he's quite right. And there's been a lot of criticism now of movements like this movement and of magazines like your magazine here as being merely pursuing the major policies of the United States, for example, in trying to find, because the United States is very interested in strengthening the progressive liberal movement in the Islamic world, which it sees as a natural ally to itself against the Salafiyah and so on. And so people say, well, you know, we shouldn't think of progressives as being on the side of, you know, light, and the Salafiyah as being on the side of darkness, because being progressive is just as uncritical. Being critical is just as uncritical as being uncritical. I mean, that sounds terrible.
Right. Very philosophical. Very philosophical.
It's a terrible way of putting it, I know. I mean, I don't think that argument is a good one myself, because I mean, it seems to me, never mind what the United States was, it seems to me it's very important, whatever sort of human being you are, that you think about how to think. I mean, it's a very important, I mean, that's what makes us human beings, I guess, as opposed to robots. I mean, we think about how we're going to think about things. You know, we stop and we think and we, you know, I mean, I take my grandson to school every morning, and he's 5, and we usually have a discussion about things. And he asks me what happens after we're dead, you know, how did the world, was it created, you know, will the world ever come to an end, you know, is it ever going to stop raining, you know, these basic metaphysical questions. And
what's your answer to?
Well,
And do you report it?
I mean, these are natural questions to arise, and we've got to address these questions, I think, in as critical a way as we possibly can. And you know, it's as I spend a lot of time in Turkey, and you know, the secularists in Turkey are just as, you know, committed to a particular unthinking point of view as the AK Party people. I mean, they're the same. I mean, but just they have a different view. Now, Ibn Rushd argued, you know, by thinking clearly about things, logically, demonstratively about things, we can escape that. He argued, we can really control our view of the world and establish it as being the best argued and the most reasonable. So I would suggest with any movement in any culture that this is a really important idea from Ibn Rushd. I mean, get the most powerful, logical method of argument on your side, and then whatever direction you're going, it will be a well thought out and well worked out path. So I'm sorry, that's a rather long-winded.
Thank you very much. Six more, but there was a gentleman at the very back, there. You had your hand up for one. Yes. Tell us who you are.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Would you mind just speaking up a little bit so we can all hear you?
I would like to hazard a conjecture concerning the question you pointed us by the reputation of demise of philosophy of the world of Islam. It seems to me if philosophy, especially of the sort you discussed, by the rational pursuit of truth, is lacking, that implies weakness of rationality. And weakness of rationality paves the way for the emergence of other type of approaches towards understanding. I'm talking about, say, the approach of the literalist championed by Fuqaha or jurists, and the approach of the Sufis, the esoteric approach. both of these approaches is that they are not advised towards rational thinking. Now, lack of rational thinking, in the very sense you mentioned, demonstrative pursuit of truth, leaves lesser room for rational dialogue. And if room for dialogue is diminished, then other means of settling disputes will gain ground. And amongst those other means, violence is a very, if you like, appealing candidate. So it seems to me that if rationality is weakened in any environment, any cultural ecosystem, then there is a tendency for the growth of embracing of violence. So this is my conjecture. I would want to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was Ibn Rushd's view. I mean, he says fitna comes from, you know, from a lack of clarity in what people are doing. I mean, it seems a bit strange. I mean, we have to think about thinking of Christian history, for example. I mean, in early Christianity, there was a big debate about the precise nature of the Trinity. And, I mean, whole communities were destroyed because they had the wrong view. I mean, and the difference between the right view and the wrong view is tiny. It's about precisely how the 3 and 1 are 3 and 1. Well, it seems tiny to me. But I mean, maybe it's very important. Well, no doubt it is very important. But it seems to me that killing hundreds of thousands of people because they have the wrong view is a bit, how shall I put it, a bit extreme. So I think you're right. I mean, violence, rationality. I mean, on the other hand, we shouldn't assume that just because we're rational, or we try to be rational, that we can work things out always in a peaceful sort of way. Because however rational we are, there are always occasions in which violence may be necessary in order to, I don't know, to preserve rationality.
But that is the last reason.
It is. Yeah.
Violence will be the first reason.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's like when a child is driving you mad and says why all the time, as children sometimes do at a certain age. You know, in the end, you say, because I said so, and you raise your, well, you shouldn't, of course, but sometimes you feel like throttling them, because if you don't do it, I will strangle you, or something like that, you know. Violence is always there in the end, perhaps. But I don't think we should think that everything can be solved rationally. I mean, how can I put it? I think that's probably what Ibn Rushd thought. I'm not sure that we ought to think that, really. Because for him, most people aren't really very rational. But that doesn't matter, he argues. It doesn't matter that most people aren't very rational. He thinks they're not very rational, not because they're stupid, but it's just not something that they think about. It's just that most people just think, most people are imaginative, you know, for Ibn Rushd. And imagination is where you react to things which are material, and you make ideas in your mind which are not very rational, but they sort of make sense to you. That's how most people are. Most people aren't very rational. But that's okay, because the Quran, for example, tells them how to live and what to do, and that's true. That's okay. But, you know, there are situations where rationality, I guess, has to be defended, according to Ibn Rushd. I mean, his predecessor, Ibn Bajjah, described philosophers in a normal country as, or an imperfect state, as nawabit, weeds. I mean, they are disregarded, like weeds are disregarded. And if they are to survive, they've got to be as inconspicuous as weeds. Otherwise, they'll get their heads chopped. And so rationality, you know, does often, in all sorts of political environments, have great difficulty in surviving the forces of violence.
Thank you. There's a lady who's been very patient there in the second row. Go ahead.
My name is Susan.
Can you speak up a little bit?
My My name is Nasreen Rahman. I'm chair of an organization called British Muslims for Secular Democracy. I'm an economist and a historian by training, so I'm not a philosopher. But I have two concerns about the framing of your book this evening. Because I understand that knowledge, philosophy, learning are actually embedded in power, economics, and other social relations. So they're not sort of free-floating processes. And I think that I know that you've been referring to the Islamic world, notwithstanding that it probably isn't, a single one Islamic world. But I think one of the reasons, perhaps poverty, lack of education, empires like Saudi Arabia, several other factors feed into this lack of curiosity and learning that you've been referring to. But I was more concerned about your framing about the Islamic world and the West as two sort of discrete entities, particularly when you're talking about Ibn Rushd. And going to the question of why didn't he speak or learn Greek? Indeed, at my hallowed institution of learning, Cambridge, we have tons of philosophers who are reading Heidegger and Marx and more contemporary philosophers like Badiou and Zizek in translation. And how wonderful that we have translations.
Sure.
So just that.
No, I think you're entirely right. I mean, translation. I mean, this was a big argument in the Islamic world of the past, whether you could actually understand something in translation. But I'm sure in Cambridge, I mean, well, I was there myself at one time, and I remember that people who were interested in Aristotle would learn Greek. I was interested in Kant, and we did Kant in German. I mean, unless you can read, it's not just Ibn Rushd, it's everybody. Al-Farabi, Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Tufayl, Al-Kindi, everybody. I mean, they weren't interested. Why weren't they interested? I mean, as far as we know, why they? Isn't this a normal thing? Is there anything unusual about this? I mean, wouldn't you, if you were interested in anything, wouldn't you want to learn the language in which it comes from? I think you're completely right. I mean, I've been talking in vast generalities. I hope when I write this thing up for the journal that it will be much more academic and, well argued. Yeah, sure.
That also, from what one's understanding is, that a lot of Greek texts, in fact, were translated by the Arabs.
Yeah.
And I would again go back to the question of power and knowledge. And I think that's critical.
Yeah.
And
sure.
Who has the power to learn language?
Yes.
When and in what context?
Sure.
So I think that's very important.
Yeah. No, I think you're right.
Yeah, I think you wanted to just come on that point.
Did it have anything to do with the nature of Arabic language?
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I'm Ziauddin Sardar, I'm the chair of the Muslim Institute. Did it have anything to do with the notion of the Arabic language and how Arabic language was perceived? In a sense, if you think that it is about the best language in the universe, then why would you possibly want to go to a secondary language to learn something, in the original, in the sense?
Sure.
So maybe that's part of the, and of course the question of power comes in. If you are the dominant civilization, you don't really want to kind of read the originals of the minor civilization.
Yes. And perhaps this is not a question that one ought to ask today about that time, because, I mean, now we learn languages if we're interested in particular thinkers, but I'm not sure our predecessors did, hundreds of years ago. I mean, and there was a big argument about translation at the time as to whether you could actually understand Greek thought if you didn't know Greek. This was a huge issue at the time. And most of the philosophers argued you could, fortunately for them, because they had no intention of learning. I don't think that's the view we would take now, but I'm not sure that in the past people actually did learn languages in order to understand ideas.
So the gentleman to Zia's left, and and we'll take another one just straight after you.
My name's Giles Godwin. I'm an Anglican priest, but I haven't yet murdered anyone for having wronged with the Trinity.
Well done.
Not yet.
Your
Not
question
yet.
about why philosophy, doesn't inform religion more is interesting, I think, and to some extent, I think it's because philosophy has itself to blame. Because if you look at the traditions of philosophy across the world, it's very often been about living the good life. If you look at Plato and Socrates and Kant and all those people, they were very interested in helping people to live a good life, and they would help people to think in order that they could live a good life. And somehow it feels to me as though philosophy has vacated that square in the last 150 years, and it's become much more analytical down the tradition. And I wonder whether you think there's anything that philosophers should do in order to re-engage with religion.
Well, of course, you know, how shall I say? I mean, there are all different sorts of philosophers, aren't there? And there are many philosophers today who are interested in that. Not necessarily from the tradition I come from, but all sorts of other philosophers are interested in those sorts of issues. And philosophy, I shouldn't use this term, in the West, has become very technical and difficult in the last, I mean, until a few hundred years ago. I mean, no philosopher, like Ibn Rushd, I mean, he didn't earn his living as a philosopher, he was all sorts of things. And in the Christian world, so-called, I mean, again, people didn't earn their living as philosophers until quite recently. I mean, it's often said that it came with Kant, that the first philosophers started to earn their living actually by teaching philosophy, and then the philosophical language became very difficult and technical because they were only writing for a particular public, and it was in their interest to make it as difficult as possible.
Do you think that knowledge is the poorer for that professionalisation?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, obviously, but it seems to me that the philosophy is part of the public sphere. I mean, I hear philosophers on the radio, I see them on the TV in Britain, less so in the United States. But no, even in the United States, philosophers are around, writing in newspapers, and they're giving talks and things, I mean, on the media. So I think philosophy is quite, and of course in the United States especially, and in the UK, I mean, philosophy classes are huge, often. I mean, it's quite, even in these difficult times, philosophy is quite popular. Philosophy books sell reasonably well. I mean, there is a market for philosophy. Publishers are keen to publish philosophy, so I'm assuming, you know, it is part of the public forum. Perhaps not as much as it ought to be, but it's there. And professionals, you know, are interested in issues of ethics, often in medicine, in engineering, in politics, in journalism. You know, people discuss these things. So it's there. I mean, we couldn't expect everybody, as Ibn Rushd said, not everybody can be a philosopher, or should want to be a philosopher. I mean, there are all sorts of different things that people should want to do. But I don't know. I mean, how shall I put it? Engaging with religion. Why should philosophy engage with religion any more than it engages with anything else, I suppose? I mean, there have been lots of debates recently in the English language literature about religion, which seems to me to be very philosophical. I mean, especially by the new atheists and whatnot. I mean, it's very sort of philosophical. And those books sell very well. And so a lot of people are reading philosophy, I guess. And I suppose that's a good thing. I mean, it's all about religion, and it's all about what sort of arguments make sense. And I think religious people are as affected by it as anybody else. Certainly in the United States, I mean, religious thinkers are heavily involved in philosophy in the United States, I would say. I don't know about here so much.
Well, hands. So I know way back, Ishihara, you had your hand up. Do you want to? We'll take them two at a time. So, yep, go ahead. Please tell us who you are.
I'm a historian, and I think I should defend my subject a little bit because you've been very harsh to my discipline. So I do feel that history could be very but I mean, Aaron Hobsbawm would say it's very interesting. That is a very interesting time. I think we are facing a kind of reductionism to that. I mean, Muslims are largely grouped into three different categories: Salafis, seculars, and Sufis. And this is a kind of reductionism that many of us, I mean, Muslims, writers, academics have internalized. I think there are lots of grey areas in between, and I think that's where maybe where philosophy could be helpful. But I think the problem is, maybe I'm being a reductionist, that more than theology and philosophy, I think the problem is the relationship between religion and politics. And Islam's, I mean, political Islam in that sense. So the politics takes over. And this is where philosophy and all this kind of question is sort of ignored. So I think this complicated relation, Islam is more political than Judaism and than Christianity or Hinduism and several other things. I think that has to be addressed in reference to philosophy. Second, I think would be that Islam, should it be seen as a deen, or should it be seen as a civilization? And most of we Muslims sadly define it as a deen, as a theology, rather than looking at it as a civilization.
Sure.
So if we define it as a civilization, then philosophy, history, literature, humor, arts, all those things will come in. And that's what I think Ibn Rushd could be studied along with Ibn Khaldun.
Yeah.
And even with Ibn Battuta.
Yeah.
I know Ibn Battuta is junior, it's all the three. But I think this is the kind of synthesis that Muslims need.
Yeah.
And this is where I'm worried that when we pigeonhole Muslims today, either you are secular, or you're Salafi, or you're Sufi, not much space is left. So like usheries, I think we're making the same mistake in the 20th century.
No, I think you're completely right.
Can I take one more question? Gentleman there in front, you had your hand up.
Hi there. My name's Farhan. I studied philosophy at Liverpool Hope. Just a quick question. Going back to your comment about Shia Islam reading more philosophy, whereas Sunnis, it's a generalization, but whereas Sunni Islam tends to look at hadith, etc. Do you think it's to do with more so the fact that, I mean, correct, I'm not a historian, so I might be wrong, but might because the Sunni Islam tended to be near Medina, where it was easy to get literature on hadith, etc., whereas the movement to Baghdad for the Shia Islam was like the less literature upon hadith, etc. So it's more of a reliance upon reading philosophy and going back to logic, etc., because there was less of a literature in hadith. Do you think, would you like to elaborate on that? That's the point as well.
Can I just take one more? The lady there, yes, back, with the glasses. Yes, you, sorry.
And I was just wondering, if you say that there is no real philosophy in the Sunni world, contemporary, let's say, or modern.
Oh, I hope I didn't say that. I said there was relatively less than there might have been.
It was interpreted that way anyway.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yep, go ahead.
Because I was going to ask, what would you call Arkun, Iqbal, Majid, Hanafi, Nashar?
Yes. Oh, no, no, there are many distinguished Arab philosophers. But I think philosophy, I don't think you can argue that philosophy has a strong role in the Arabic intellectual universe compared, not that it has a strong role anywhere else either, but I mean it is particularly weak, I think.
Would you not say that the individuals mentioned had an impact on their societies, though? Like Iqbal or Arkun?
Iqbal, perhaps. Arkun, no, I don't think so. Not in Algeria, I don't think. I mean, France, certainly. But I mean, I don't know. It's, these are all important and distinguished people, and I've written about them. I think they're very great, they're really interesting thinkers. But I'm arguing that there seems that philosophy, many philosophers in the Islamic world feel they're under attack in ways which is not true of philosophers in different cultural environments. That basically is my suggestion, and I was wondering what impact this might have on intellectual life. I mean, there is plenty of philosophy in the Arab world, but not as much as one might expect, it seems to me. Why did Arkun leave Algeria to do his philosophy? I mean, would he have been able to do what he did had he stayed in Algeria? I think the answer is probably not. I mean, it's difficult to be a philosopher in many countries. As our colleague over there said, I mean, of course, there are difficult regimes to do anything in some parts of the world. And that's got nothing to do with Islamic civilization. It's to do with political conditions, perhaps. But poor old Darkoon had real problems even in France. I mean, people really made life very difficult for him often. Yeah.
I'm going to end with, we are a little bit short of time, and I can see so many hands up. I'm sure we could have easily had another hour. But Professor Leaman, I'd like to ask you, if you could, who would be your favourite philosopher of the present times living, and who would be your favourite philosopher of the past times, in whichever tradition,
Oh, God.
and why?
Oh, God. I never thought of it. But I suppose my favourite...
There's a philosopher saying I never thought of that.
Never thought of that. Well, I didn't like to pick favourites. It's sort of... How shall I put it?
It's a bit of a Twitter generation question, I know.
Yeah. Well,
Not that I do.
I suppose I'm keen on... I'm keen on Kant. Immanuel Kant, I'm keen on.
And why would that be?
I think he's a wonderful philosopher. I mean, how shall I put it? In fact, I've just given a talk on Kant and Hadith, in which I used an idea from the Critique of Pure Reason to develop a most peculiar notion of why the Hadith ought to be taken more seriously than they often are in philosophy. And Kant is that sort of really potent thinker who can give you idea. I mean, he never stops giving you ideas about things, I think.
What about from the present, from today's generation?
You mean living?
Living, yes.
Oh, living. Oh, gosh.
Someone we can all Google.
Yeah.
Yes, present company.
Yes. No,
Accepted.
I don't know. I don't think we have any really major thinkers around at the moment.
In any tradition?
I don't think so. I mean, we don't have any outstanding philosophers, in my humble opinion. I mean, I don't think they've all... I mean, Wittgenstein was my favourite 20th century philosopher, but I don't think really that, you know, there were giants in the past, but I think we're living in a fairly fallow philosophical period at the moment. But, I mean, in the United States, analytical philosophy has now become very, very mathematical and even more divorced from what ordinary people are interested in than was the case in the past. No, so I'm afraid I really can't.
Well, on that slightly depressing note, I would like to thank Professor Oliver Leaman. But before we completely end the formal proceedings, I'd like to invite our co-director, Meryl Davis, to give us some closing words.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Leaman for opening our minds to some of the important applications. We wouldn't have thought of it. I mean, philosophers are not necessarily practical people. But I do believe that there are immensely important practical implications of what you have spoken to us about tonight. So much of what happens in the Muslim community that puts us in the news comes from people saying, I do it because that's what my religion is. That's what I've been told. That's what is traditional. If you leave us with the thought that Ibn Rushd is inviting us not to do things just because they are traditional, it couldn't be a more timely reminder and a more timely call to bestir ourselves to think. The reason I say this is because there was, last week, every single night, the first item on the national news appeared to be some horror story from the Muslim community in Britain or from around the Muslim world. In each instance, I am sure those people concerned would have said, I do it because my religion tells me to. And who is there, either in the Muslim community or the non-Muslim community, to ask critical questions about what does Islam require of its followers, or to think through their response to belief? And I think that the other thing that it's so important that you have actually guided us to is the ethical issues that affect the professions. We have Muslims who serve in all of the professions in this country, and yet each one of them, so far as I can tell, is afraid to enter into debate about ethical issues because no Maulvi has pronounced upon it. Because they do not assume that they have authority to question and think for themselves without the imprimatur of some Maulvi. And that is the greatest let and hindrance on the development of our civilization in today's world. Unless we take responsibility for working out the difficulties, we are always going to be at the mercy of those who have a very simplistic answer, which usually involves violence, about what should be done. So I am most grateful to you for alerting us to the issues that we need to be thinking about and the importance of thinking. I've never quite understood philosophy in the sense of reading philosophical books because I've never understood mathematical equations. You have made life so much easier for me tonight. And if Ibn Rushd said the only people we should have confidence in are philosophers, when it comes to you, sir, I am most prepared to agree. Thank you so much. There is just one other thing that I would like to say. I wish to express our thanks to the Halal Food Foundation, not just for sponsoring this this event annually, but also for a legend which says halal is more than food. How absolutely thought-provoking. We thank them. And therefore, I commend to you the fact that there will in fact be food outside for you to partake while you carry on the discussion and the thinking process, which we so urge you to undertake. Thank you.